So when you hear the word confession, what's the first thing that comes up to your mind?
Catholic.
Catholic.
No.
Somebody else?
A criminal who confesses.
There you go. It's a statement of wrong,
Yeah.
a confession,
Saying sorry.
saying I'm sorry.
Kneeling.
So when you see the word confession on a church document, does that sound like the same word? You think that we're confessing how wrong we've been? It's not what it means. The word comes from the Latin fare, meaning to speak, and con means together, as in reconcile. You heard that earlier. It's just together. So a confession means something we say together. That's all. In this sense, when a church uses that word, a confession about a statement of beliefs, let's put it that way, it's something we can say together. Not every tradition likes that. The Baptists have no confessions. They don't think it's right for the body to decide that we all think this thing together. They may punish people for not thinking the right thing, but they don't say them out loud in the confession. And the UCC, which was Heather's tradition for a while, they also avoid confessional statements, as I understand it.
They say they are testimonies, not tests of faith,
Okay.
is their phrase.
Oh.
So they like acknowledge they exist,
Uh-huh.
but certainly don't read them in worship and wouldn't have them as a document for the
Right.
church.
My first experience or memory, I should say, of a line from a confession came to me as a child because my mother loved this so much. And you know how it is when your parents are good guides into faithful living. Not every parent is happily. So some are, many are. In fact, many are. And certainly this love of my mother for this sentence. But the question is from Calvin's Geneva Confession, I believe, but I might be wrong, which is, what is the chief, I'm going to have to say the word man at the end of this, but you'll understand, it means everybody. What is the chief end, purpose and end of man or of humans? And the answer is never going to go away, to glorify God and enjoy God forever. Yeah. What a wonderful sentence burst forth from the heart of John Calvin for 500 years, almost 500 years ago, to glorify God and enjoy God forever. So that's in the nature of a confession. The Presbyterian Church has adopted 9 confessions over the years. One of them begins, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker. And you know the name of that one. And then the Nicene Creed is also among the 9, also ancient, as you know. And then the rest come from the early Reformed tradition in the 1500s, 1600s. They have various names. And the 20th century saw the adoption of 2 new confessions. And I want us to focus on a feature of that adopting. First of all, it's done by the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church. Everybody has some familiarity with that, a legislative body whose members come from all of the presbyteries, some clergy and some lay in our tradition, always trying to share that equally. And the General Assembly considers a text, or at least in the 20th century, considers a text, recommends the text to the presbyteries, which do or don't vote for it. I had the well, let's look at the just this is kind of a skipping quickly over something. The first of the 20th century confessions is called the Barmen Declaration. Some of you have heard of that. But it's worthy of note. I didn't copy it out and we won't address it today. But the Barmen Declaration comes from what's called the Confessing Church of Germany. And what were they confessing? They were saying together, right? That meaning of confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord, not, they were pretty explicit about it without saying the name, not Adolf Hitler. And it was so dangerous to say that in the late 1930s, so dangerous to say Jesus, not Hitler, that you could literally be imprisoned and killed for saying. I mean, if somebody has a bumper sticker, I saw it decades ago that says, if it were illegal to be a Christian, could they find any evidence against you? Boy, oh boy, they sure did in the 1930s. And of course, a larger percentage of the church went along and said Heil Hitler. Not Hail Mary or Hail Jesus, but Heil Hitler. They were happy to just shut up, hunker down, and let Hitler and his gang kill and slaughter and so on. So the church can find itself in the midst of terribly difficult times. And the Barmen Declaration, so moving to read. I recommend you look it up. Of course, these days you can just type in a Google search if you want. It's not very long. It is riveting to see men and women standing up for faith in the midst of a terribly violent and destructive time. That feature of the Barmen Declaration, responding to a crisis, is something that the Presbyterian Church has wished to adhere to in the subsequent choices of confessions. And we'll look at today the Confession of 1967. Judging from our ages, roughly, probably most of us could answer in a sentence what kind of crisis was unfolding in America in 1967 that led the then Presbyterian Church, it had a different name, UPC, USA, never mind, to adopt a confession, the Confession of 1967, which we'll look at in more detail shortly. The next confession that was adopted is called the Brief Statement of Faith. Have you ever used that in worship or otherwise encountered it? It's a short statement. And I once preached about a whole year from it because each of its lines, there are about 60 lines, so it fit a year pretty well, is scripturally rooted, and it makes for some good thinking. The question is, what was the crisis? In 1991, I was actually a delegate from this presbytery to Baltimore, the GA in Baltimore in that year, and was on the floor when it was being debated. I made, well, I have the details somewhere in my memory. I made one motion to amend the document, which was rejected by the assembly. It says, I wish I could remember fully accurately what the sentence is. It's something like God cares for everyone regardless how they sort out their lives. That's not what it said, but it's like that. And my amendment was, though we don't. or though we do not do this well. That was the gist of it. And they go, whoa, we don't want any confession in our confession. That's a little overstated, but I wasn't surprised it was rejected. But I felt it needed to be raised. The crisis in the point of view of the church for the 1991 Brief Statement of Faith was that people didn't know what to believe anymore. They didn't have, if you should read any of the older confessions, the Helvetic, the Heidelberg, the old one, but Heidelberg belonged to Lutherans, I guess. You will find a language that's very stilted, not easy to get into, not easy to use. And so this was an effort to find a language that was contemporary accessible and not too long. Some of the confessions go on for pages and pages. And so that, I think it's reasonably successful, but it's an odd sort of crisis because it wasn't a social justice crisis like Barmy in C-67. That's the short reference to this confession. It's called C-67 Common. I'll use that sometimes. But rather a kind of a breakdown in the ability of members to articulate the faith. And that could, sure, that's a crisis. Bit of a aside in Bible study. The book of Deuteronomy is almost certainly that kind of writing from the 600s BC, where there was a breakdown in the interest that the people, or the lack of interest the people had in their tradition, the Yahweh tradition. And so a new reading of the old story with everything in Deuteronomy puts Moses speaking in the first person. He's like, he steps out of the page and says, I. And that's not found at all in Exodus. It's always he. And suddenly it's like a third dimension. It's so much more compelling. And the reason for it, I could back this up with scholarly reports, but I'm not gonna, is that the people were lagging in interest in their own religious tradition. They didn't care anymore. And this was an effort to spur that up. So that's a good reason. However, in 2016, that's 21st century, our General Assembly and the Presbytery has adopted the ninth and the last tradition, the last confession, and it's called Belhar. It's real short. You have a copy, and my copy, it fits on 3 pages of a booklet. And Belhar is written by the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa. It was written in 1986, and it swam slowly across the waters. And the Presbyterian Church said, oh, we should adopt that. Actually, of course, there were people advocating for its adoption for quite a long time. I don't know why there was resistance, because the crisis in South Africa in 86, you remember? 86, this is well before Nelson Mandela is released from Robben Island. This is when apartheid is out there saying, we 17 white people control all of you 60 million blacks, and we're keeping it that way. I'm only exaggerating my numbers a little. And that horror became a matter of attention for the Dutch South African Church. God bless them with that. And Belhar is that statement. To have drawn it into the PC USA, our denomination's confession, is a good thing. Should it have taken 30 years? I don't know about that one way or the other. It took 30 years, and it's there. So that's a brief history of making confessions and adopting them. Any thoughts about that? Yeah, Paul.
Because it was so close to 86 is not that many years from when South Africa was born as a multiracial type of a situation.
That's right.
System. I'm wondering if this also helped push the buttons.
I wonder.
On
That's
the
great.
breakdown.
I'm not enough of I don't have
Yeah,
that.
no, I mean,
It's a
one of
marvelous
those things
question.
that-
Marvelous question. It's really great.
Can you restate, what's the 30-year gap? It's 1986 in South Africa, and when is
2016,
here?
the General Assembly and the Presbytery said, yeah, we should add that to our Book of Confessions. The Book of Confessions is about yay thick with ordinary paper. Oh.
For those who are curious, we have 3 copies here. I have more somewhere, but I couldn't find them when I was looking for them, but I didn't use them
You don't
with
need to confess.
confirmation class. Yeah,
In confirmation.
yeah, we went, had a session about them in confirmation.
In the text of in the understanding of the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church, It involves the Bible, this book, and what you know as the Book of Order. Some of you familiar with that phrase, which gives many directions as to how we will govern ourselves in worship, in discipline, and in ordering our authorities. So the confessions are part of the Constitution. And when a person is ordained in our tradition, she is asked, among other questions, do you accept the confessions of the church as valid expositions of the faith, or something along those lines?
Well, the question is, will you be guided by
Thank-
the book of confessions?
Thank
Not do you accept, but will you be guided?
Boy, did I need that, I needed that guidance. Thank you, Paul. That's exactly right, because we've had fights through the years where, for example, Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was the first pastor of the Riverside Church in New York, 10 years before he became Riverside's pastor, he was the preacher, only preacher, he's a Baptist, but First Presbyterian of Manhattan
Yep.
invited Fosdick to be their preacher. He was the most well-known preacher in America at the time, and he was wide open to the sciences in a manner that thrilled many people and horrified many others, especially those who feared the theory of evolution. Fosdick said that believing in the literal virgin birth was not a necessary tenet of Christian faithfulness, and blew our denomination open for several years, because the leaders of the denomination, many of them wanted to, in fact, they threatened him. They said, either you join as a Presbyterian minister so we can punish you, or you leave that pulpit in Manhattan. And he chose the latter.
Question about, as I recall, at some point there was a southern organized that Presbyterian group. And there was more of a northern and.
That's quite right.
They're definitely.
And when did that reunification take place?
Great question.
And how did it affect confession?
Wonderful, wonderful. The split occurred in 1858. The Northern Church and the Southern Church. What sort of crisis do you think led to that split? It's, you know, what did Faulkner say? History is not, maybe you know this phrase, history's not over, it's not even past, or he says it better than that. But that history is always here, living within us. So that split took place then. And it was doctrinal, because the Northern Church insisted, I don't know what confessional document they might have used, but they insisted that slavery was anathema. I'm going to introduce a word from Old Latin, anathema. Many of the older confessions say this behavior or belief is anathema, meaning it's contrary to the truth. It's anathema. And so there's a kind of a curse word placed on a behavior or a belief, anathema. And certainly slavery became anathema, just as you could say it is anathema in the Bellhart text. You'll find the phrase, I think I may have caused it to be in boldface, we reject any doctrine. That's how they, the Belhar tradition, restated the word anathema. They chose to use we reject. It's clearer, right? Than to say anathema, but there it is. So now Paul asked the question, when did North and South come together again? And had it anything to do with the confessions? Probably yes, but here's the date. In 1983. Reverend Robert Lamar, some of you are familiar with.
Right.
He was moderator of the assembly, the General Assembly, either in that year or a near year. And he had worked tirelessly. My dad and Bob were very good friends, but Bob had a much bigger stage. He was playing here in not just in Albany, but throughout the nation, because he was well, he was just involved in many, many questions, including that, shall we be reunited? And the General Assembly met that year in Biloxi, Mississippi, of all places. Wow. Did you?
I did my internship.
How do you like that?
It was
Biloxi.
awful.
I've never been there. It was what?
It was awful.
It was awful.
We liked Biloxi as a city. I mean, it was very nice and they had great seafood because it was right on the coast. But it was a culture shock. Because we were newlyweds, you know, I was 21 years old and I was from Ohio. I would say I was a moderate in terms of where I stood. And it was like walking into a time warp.
My bad.
It was like back in the 1950s. I'm like, whoa, you know,
So which decade were you there?
we were there in the 1970s. I'm
70,
trying to remember. There was so long.
74,
Sure.
75.
So less than 10 years later, the General Assembly met there and did agree. First, the Southern Church and the Northern Church met in separate locations, and then they joined in worship and perhaps.
I thought it was 89.
No, it was 83.
Well, and then I was there. I was thinking 89, but okay, whatever you say. Yeah.
Well, I know it for a number of reasons, but 89, I was already a pastor. And I know it was past.
All right, oh, wait,
At that-
whatever, doesn't matter.
No, no, really. But the joined church set about creating a confessional statement, partly to help the North and the South join, partly. That was an element. It also gave instructions that there be a new hymnal. And the hymnal that you no longer use because you're up to date, but the Riverside Church is still using the 1991 hymnal. Yeah, and it was a good hymnal, but it's good to join with the new ones when they come along. That was released in 91. So there are efforts to bind the two together. We could go on about how it has been hard, but that's not really our subject today. So that's one take on your question, Paul. Yeah, yeah. Anything else before we look a little more closely at these?
I just wanted to speak to your talking about, you know, the Nazis and all that. And as a musician, this is something that interests me. People who were musicians back then, basically, they were required to join the Nazi party. It was kind of like having your union card for the musicians union. If you didn't do that, you didn't work. And it was a real ethical conflict for musicians because they didn't actively participate in the atrocities, but they had to get the green card, so to speak.
Boy, thanks for that.
Yeah, and I talked to years ago some musicians that were still alive from that era, and like, yeah, you had to suck it up and just
Wow.
you know, otherwise you didn't get any work. And I think people now looking back don't understand the kind of ethical dilemma that put musicians in.
I imagine that's right. But we're starting to get close because something like the Kennedy Center,
Yeah.
any number of performers have said, no, not going. Unfortunately, they're not being punished.
Right, but they're not gonna be put to death because, yeah, because of that.
Right.
Not yet, anyway.
Yeah.
Right,
Not without consequence.
Yes.
I mean,
Right.
it really financial consequence.
Right.
yeah, those people who canceled their performances didn't.
I mean, some of those are really superstar people who don't, are gonna be fine financially, but you've heard about a couple, we're digressing, but some of them, this was gonna be their big break,
Yeah.
their big chance. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
we digress.
So confessions sometimes get into all kinds of formal doctrine, the older ones, as to things you must believe. That's not so, really fine doctrinal points, such as, of course, the virgin birth and some others. Those would be from the 16th century, from the 17th century. It's not a thing that was in these more recent. And I take a look at the Belhar with me for a moment. The first statement is not a surprise. It's a belief in the Trinity. And it's stated like that. without any consequence being associated with the belief. I've often observed that unless you can, in fact, say why a particular belief has consequences in your own life, maybe you ought to put that one on the shelf. Because it isn't that important to you if it isn't showing up in your life. I'm not saying that that's an error to have included it here, but it's something to bear in mind that a belief shows up in behavior, right? Or can show up in behavior. The next is the unity of the Christian church. Everybody here knows, I'm sure, that the word Catholic, when it appears in the Apostles' Creed, is small c. In order to remind the reader, should she not know it, the Catholic is simply the Greek word for kataholos, meaning universal. And then there's today's word in the first bullet. Christ's work of reconciliation is made manifest in the church as a community of believers who have been reconciled with God and one another. That's certainly a fine, succinct statement, similar to all the uses of the word reconciled found in the New Testament. I'm not going to do every point because of the time, but I'm skipping to the third bullet. That this, do you have bullets, Mike?
Yeah.
Good. That this unity must become visible. That's the first really strong statement here. So the world may believe that separation, enmity, and hatred between people is just must be resisted. So that's a strong statement, very hard to accomplish, needless to say. And then similar one, the next bullet follows it up. This unity must be manifested, active in a variety of ways, in that we experience, practice, and pursue community with one another. I want to back up into the word community for a moment. You are a community. That's hardly a surprising sentence. I had the opportunity because I knew I was preaching for quite a little while. Heather's invitation wasn't last week. It was 6 weeks ago, maybe. So I had lots of books that I chose to look at. And one was Parker Palmer's Healing the Heart of Democracy. It's a beautiful. And then he says again and again that not only my sermon was focused on the heart within ourselves, but he points out that unless there are institutions where a person can practice, be corrected, and try again, that the community is where that heart lives, where it can break. He loves to use, as I'm sure you do, the word, an open heart is a broken heart, right out of Psalm 51. If you're hard-hearted, your heart will never break and you'll never see any of the suffering in the world. So, of course, it's meaningful to me as pastors. When pastors leave a church or retire, they don't have that community. You leave in order to let the new pastor, I see the pastors nodding. It's tricky to find your way into a community again. And I can feel so well that you live as a community. This is where the heart beats, breaks, and opens, is right here. And so the fact that Belhar comes at that word is no surprise. To practice and pursue community with one another. I'm going to skip to it's several bullets down, a place where you find the word therefore we reject any doctrine. You find that?
Yeah, the head
No. So here's that word anathema, translated into modern language. Therefore we reject any doctrine. And boy, oh boy, can you feel the urgency of that church in South Africa when you read these next few bullets. Any doctrine which absolutizes either natural diversity or the sinful separation of people. Any doctrine which professes that this spiritual unity is truly being maintained while believers of the same confession are in effect alienated from one another for the sake of diversity and despair of reconciliation.
Mhm.
Any doctrine which denies that a refusal to pursue this visible unity as a priceless gift is sin. That's a little complicated sentence. Any doctrine which denies this as a sin, we reject any denial of this sin. We reject any doctrine that says that isn't sin. Any doctrine which explicitly or implicitly maintains the descent or any other human or social factor should be a consideration in determining church membership. Oh, that is wonderful, so clear. And let it be said, Christian nationalism, alive and like a virus, alive like a virus in this nation, is everything that is condemned here. It is totally committed to whiteness and to Christians, not other persons of other faiths. It is anathema, a terrible, terrible scourge of a doctrine. Need I say, in my opinion? Of course, I do have to say that. But nevertheless, thoughts coming up as you read these startling doctrinal. We reject. What comes to heart? What comes to mind?
There are many churches that want to vet people before they'll allow them to become members.
Yep, that's true.
And sometimes it's something really petty too.
Yeah.
South Africa and Namibia both went through this time of being called to account for apartheid.
Uh-huh.
And many were saying, we reject this, it's like an anathema, we called it out. And that was, it's been important that even churches not in those places,
Right.
that, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, they all said, no.
Thank you. Yeah.
It is interesting to me in a statement calling for unity that you get this "we reject,"
Yes.
including if you won't say that this stuff is a sin, right? We reject that. Of course, it's not saying we reject the person.
Correct.
It's saying we reject the doctrine, but I don't think anybody would be uninformed that this doctrine is associated with a group of people. So there is a rejection of a group of people in this, or at least what that group of people believes, right?
Certainly what they believe.
It's to me, that's interesting. We had a experience on our session just in the last several months where we adopted ourselves a statement that the Albany Presbytery had adopted.
Uh-huh.
And we've even posted a link to it outside the front of the church. And it says, we cannot remain silent, which was the statement, the title of this statement. And it was a statement that the Albany Presbytery made at the beginning of the current presidential administration. But it's very much specifically around attacks on immigrants and refugees in the country.
Oh, yeah.
When our session voted to adopt this statement that had been created and adopted by the Presbytery, we adopted it as a congregation. There was a lot of debate in the session, and one of the session members said, but if we adopt this statement, aren't we at risk of alienating everybody who for example, might feel more aligned with the current administration. And wouldn't it be, wouldn't we lose our chance to be in relationship, do you know what I mean? To really be in community with and really connect with the very people who we want to, well, change their minds, right? You know, but
Break their hearts.
you know what I'm saying? So, and I found that to be very interesting as a question for the session to
Yeah,
consider.
thank you for that. It reminds me of a new members class I was conducting in Spencertown at the St. Peter's Church back in the mid-90s. And there came a new person, well, they're both new, that's a new members class. I'm gonna call the more conservative Connie and the more liberal Libby for this little story. And after the first session together, Connie called me and said, if Libby continues in the class, I have to drop out. And Libby called me and said, if Connie continues in the class, I have to drop out. Oh, wow. It was just basically the question the session was dealing with, right? I could say something to Libby that I could not say to Connie. I said, Libby, we are engaged here in this church with a very, very high question, which is, can we accept those who reject? Can we find a way to embrace those who refuse the embrace of others, to embrace others? I said, I don't even know the answer, whether it's possible to open the arms to people whose arms are closed. I don't know, but I want you to try this with me. Libby said, okay. I couldn't say to Connie, can't, right? Is there no way to go there? I can't say, you're conservative, we're kind of not. How about trying this out for a while? I mean, I did say that I said, well, I hope you'll stay with us. She did not. That did not surprise me. I didn't try to stay connected after she and her husband dropped away. But this is a great question and a tough one. How to be reconciled. It's a great question.
Were you successful? Did they stay in the class?
Oh, the class went forward. Libby
Did-
stayed,
The
Libby
only
joined,
one stayed.
but Connie did not.
You couldn't bridge that gap.
We couldn't. Or I could say she could not.
I want to bring this as a little bit of a tangent, but we are in danger with our use of language at this point because we continue to use what in my view are outmoded phrase of conservative.
Oh, I couldn't
and
agree
liberal,
more.
because
Couldn't
a
agree.
conservative is not conservative, they are radical.
I agree.
Radical, and when we affix a term from the past, we are granting a level of respect. You know, conservatives are, you know, respectable on the whole. Where we're at this point in history is not the people who are calling conservatives are, in my view, misnamed, they are radical. And so I just throw that in the mix, and I'm sorry for diverging from your.
No,
central
I
topic,
say the same. I
but-
agree completely. My Libby Connie was necessary.
I'm sorry,
For brevity's sake.
I do apologize, but I, you know, that it is something I see in the news, I see in our conversation, and I think it doesn't, our language hasn't kept up with the times we're living.
That's true.
Which are great change.
That's true.
And on the other side, I've heard the other side call the other side the same name, so.
Yeah.
It would be funny if, I don't know if they're aware of that, but they're also the same name.
Call the liberals radical.
The same name, it's just,
It's the other, yeah.
it's just hate, period.
So I don't want to go into great more detail in Belhar, but just notice how it concludes. Under number 4, several bullets with the kind of progressive, to use another, progress means we step forward.
Yeah.
Literally stepping forward. If you look at the deep word roots under word progress, to step forward. So, that in a world full of injustice and enmity, God is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged. Way back in the 1980s, the bishops of the Catholic bishops gathered in Lima, Peru, and adopted a phrase known as God has a preferential option for the poor. Well, that caused a lot of stir, because the rich, the capitalists, the white of North America just didn't like the idea that God prefers the poor. But that's what this statement is saying, and it's a very fascinating question to deal with. You know, in Mary's Magnificat, the voice of Mary is led to say, the mighty have been thrown down from their thrones, and the rich he has sent empty away. Well, if they've been sent empty away, what are they? They're empty and they're away. And then they become among the poor and the destitute. That's kind of interesting that process might be afoot. Most of these are drawn right from Scripture. That for God, pure and undefiled religion is to visit the orphans and the widows in their suffering. The only question one might pose is, orphans and widows is the constant Hebrew Bible affirmation of those who need special attention and care. Who are they now? The orphans and the sojourner, also the migrant, is always in the Old Testament. You care for him and her as you move for yours. It's right there. What are these religionists doing, saying anything but that? I don't know. So it ends with, we reject any ideology which would legitimate forms of injustice, and any doctrine which is unwilling to resist such an ideology in the name of the gospel. We believe that in obedience to Jesus Christ, the church is called to confess and to do all these things. That is biblical. I'm very glad that our denomination adopted it. I want to look more, I don't know, what's our time frame?
It is 10:30, we often end, 12:30, we often end about now.
Okay,
We have another confession to look at, shall we extend by 10 minutes or so?
Yes.
Sure.
Is that okay?
it's okay with me,
Okay.
sure. 5. Maybe 5, all right.
You can do that.
Here's an odd thing, if you were to look at in one or both of those books there, C-67, the Confession of 1967, you would find non-inclusive gender language
That's right.
so aggressive, it almost hurts your ears.
Yeah.
To hear it, it's man, he, man, and so in, I think it was in 2002, Joseph Small from the Office of Theology and Worship and others pulled together an inclusive language text, and they put a footnote on every single time when the language was changed. There are 140 of them. 140 inclusive edits in the text. It makes it, I think it makes it hard to read. I really do. But this is more ordinary. One thing that puzzles me about the C-67 is the crisis of our nation then as now. That's 55 years, no, almost 60 years now. was race. I mean, honestly. Several of the well-known riots, Watts, I think Detroit, Newark was in 67. Some of you may remember other dates, other riots. Here in Albany, 68 was when the fires began, after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I remember being here in the city. I lived in Del Mar, And my mother was so angry with me when I came home one night. And I didn't know why, and then I could feel it from her. Her anger was basically just the horror of the violence of this nation, the killing of Robert Kennedy and Martin King inside the last 8 or 10 weeks. And she was just overwrought. And that her son was out at 11 p.m. or whatever, and she knew I was in the city. And it wasn't really all that personal, like you bad boy. It was just, ah. Anyway, this text doesn't read like that to me. You'll take time and maybe you'll see for yourself. It's too calm. It's just too calm. And it does spend a lot of time getting at various details of doctrine, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and in Jesus Christ, true humanity was realized once for all. There's nothing wrong with anything that's said here. My ministry, my years in ministry have made me impatient for this kind of verbiage. It's just, it says things like, the victim of sin, meaning Jesus, became victor and won the victory over sin and death for all. That the various ways that the work of Jesus saves are summarized as these are expressions of a truth which remains beyond the reach of all theory. The same Jesus Christ is the judge of all people. My note at the bottom is how. It doesn't try to answer, and that's maybe okay. But to say Jesus Christ is judge of all people, I don't think that's a useful idea. Why? You cannot show me any manifestation of it that's just working. And there are lots of Buddhists and Jews and Muslims and so forth, and non-believers who would say, what is that? What are you trying to do by saying Jesus Christ? Say it for yourselves, speak for yourselves, reconcile in yourself before you come at us with your doctrinal statements that cover us all. That's my attitude. Be careful. And
There's also a paragraph in there about sexual relations, which is rather bland or a little confusing. I think it would not be written today in that same way,
I completely
as I
agree.
recall. Not confusion in sexual relations. What does that mean? Something like that. So it's not very helpful, I don't think.
Well, moreover, the Presbyterian Church in the 1960s was bubbling up toward the agreement of sorts in 1978 that said explicitly that the persons who are you probably use the word homosexual, which we've tended not to use lately for many years, are not able to be ministers within the church. You
Well,
just,
that's a different, yeah.
that was 10 years later. But my point is that frustration over some churches accepting and most rejecting homosexuality was bubbling up. So I was going to make a similar point. I think, glad you raised it here. When this document finally gets around to we reject, to a kind of anathema, the title of the section is, it's 9.43, if anybody happens to be following along. In each time and place, come on, get to the point. There are particular problems and crises through which God calls the church to act. The following, I'm skipping because it's too verbose. The following are particularly urgent at the present time. Now, these are the ones named. Again, long paragraph, the sentence in the middle is God overcomes the barriers between sisters and brothers and breaks down every form of discrimination based on racial or ethnic difference. Got it. Race is a problem. And so he has identified. The next point. The church in its own life is called to practice the forgiveness of enemies and to commend to the nations as practical politics, the search for cooperation and peace. Okay, there's a war going on. That's a very tame sentence in the middle of the Vietnam War, but there it is. It's stated, seek peace. The next bullet says, the reconciliation of humankind makes it, through Christ, makes it plain that enslaving poverty in a world of abundance is an intolerable violation of God's good creation. Okay, so three things are named, and then there's a fourth one named, which is bad sex. Really? We have to go from racism, materialism, and poverty, and bad sex. Those are the things that need our attention, says C67, which is for the very reason that Paul raised up. It wouldn't be written that way now, but it was written that way. Notice however, racism, materialism, and poverty. Excuse me, militarism. I meant to say racism, militarism, and poverty. In his speech at the Riverside Church on April 4, 1967, Riverside always remembers this because it was 1 year before his assassination, and he stood there in the chancel, it wasn't a sermon, at the Riverside Church to deliver a speech called Beyond Vietnam. It is an extraordinarily meaningful speech. We'll look it up, read it again. You will not be disappointed by its clarity. It kind of outshines this in that regard. But in there, he says that unless we swiftly change from a thing-oriented to a people-oriented, what he calls the true revolution of values, we will never overcome the giant triplets, his phrase, the giant triplets of materialism, militarism, and racism. Materialism, racism, and militarism. And he raises these three up. Reverend Barber, William Barber, I'm sure some of you follow him. Barber has added to the giant triplets two more. So now we have the giant quintuplets. They are climate disaster and Christian nationalism. God bless him to bring out five. And he lays them out really clear in short, clear statements, unlike C67. And I want to point out something. If you look at all these together, you can see that the metaphor of triplets or quintuplets is useful. It means they have the same root, right? That they're all connected. And they are. They're connected. My interpretation is that they are connected in greed. Militarism, like the thing that's happening right now on the news, is based in greed. That's what's really happening, I believe. Racism would not exist except for the greediness of the color, the pale faces who saw advantages in putting them down so that we can have more. It's a kind of sickness, a greediness. Obviously, to involve oneself in excessive materialism, that's what greed, that's usually where we go with the word greed. Why is climate disaster unfolding? We know it's caused this. We will not stop. That's greed. And Christian nationalism is a weird kind of greed. It's only we have Jesus. All the rest of you go to hell. Not so good. So C67 got to some things in its time, in its way. It's timid for my taste, and I think Belhar shows it up better. Shows a better way to get quickly at the crisis that they faced in the last century. And maybe a new confession needs to come forth in our time.
With that, and let's end our time together, but I am so grateful that, I have a feeling we're gonna see you again. We've been seeing Steve in worship here and there,
Here and there.
and, what a blessing to have you come, not just to preach, but to lead this time with us, and, I want you to know that Steve jumped into a series of sermons and a series of second hours that are all of a theme. And next time you come, you can preach on anything you want. But that's, especially I'm aware of that today for this second hour, you really fulfilled an assignment that I gave you
Yeah.
in talking about the church's confessions in this ministry of reconciliation. But you did so in a way that so enlivened my connection to this, as a somewhat skeptical newbie to this whole idea of having a book of confessions. That was terrific. So thank you all very much.